The archive is open. Come in out of the cold, your chair is where you left it, the one by the lamp. Tonight I've pulled something old from the shelves, the lost Library of Alexandria, and the long, quiet story of how a city tried to gather the world's memory in one place. You don't need to remember any of this. There's no test at the end. If you drift, I'll keep reading. Let's begin. Before there were shelves, there was a harbor. That is the first thing to know about Alexandria. It was not built inland, tucked safely among farms and old villages. It stood at the edge of the Mediterranean, where ships came in from Greece, Cyprus, Syria, the Aegean Islands, and the long coast of North Africa, carrying grain and wine, glass and linen, sailors with bad knees, merchants with careful hands, and stories that had crossed more water than anyone in the city could measure. The city itself was young by Egyptian standards. Egypt already had temples old enough to make most kingdoms look temporary. The pyramids were already ancient. The Nile had been keeping its slow brown schedule for longer than anyone could remember. And then, after Alexander came through with his maps and ambition and the bright speed of conquest, a new city was laid out near the western mouth of the Nile, facing the sea rather than the river alone. Alexandria was meant to be an entrance. You can feel that in its position. Behind it lay Egypt with its grain fields, temple towns, tax offices, scribes, and river roads. In front of it lay the sea, restless and full of languages. A person arriving by ship did not enter Egypt through silence. He entered through shouting quays, rope, gulls, wet wood, cargo lists, harbor dues, sailors asking where to drink, and officials asking what had been brought. And above all of that, eventually, there was the Pharos, the lighthouse on its island, one of the great wonders people liked to name when they were making lists of impossible human things. We should be careful with wonders. Later writers liked them tall, shining, and exact, and sometimes made them taller and shinier than stone can easily be. But the lighthouse was real, and it mattered. It stood out on the island of Pharos, guiding ships toward the harbor by day and by flame at night, a vertical promise that the city was awake and could be found. That is a good image for the library too, though the library had no flame at the top. It was another kind of beacon, built not to guide hulls through water, but to guide minds through memory. A ship saw the Pharos and knew where to land. A scholar saw Alexandria and knew where to look. The rulers who followed Alexander, the Ptolemies, understood that power did not only sit in armies and taxes. It sat in grain, of course, because a hungry city is not loyal for long. It sat in coin. It sat in stone walls and ships. But it also sat in prestige, in being the place where learned people wished to go, where old poems could be compared, where maps could be improved, where kings could say, quietly but unmistakably, that the memory of the world was being kept under their roof. So when we speak of the Library of Alexandria, it is tempting to picture one grand room, with columns and shelves and a single door through which all knowledge entered, and one day all knowledge burned. That picture is neat, which is one of the reasons it survives. Real things are usually less neat. The library was connected to a larger institution, the Mouseion, the shrine or house of the Muses, a community of scholars supported by royal money. There were probably collections in more than one place. There were storerooms, workrooms, copying rooms, catalogues, and men arguing over lines of poetry with the seriousness other men brought to borders. But the harbor came first, because the harbor made the dream possible. A library that wants the world must have a way for the world to arrive. Scrolls came with travelers. Texts came in baggage, in trade, in gifts, in seizures, in copies made because a ruler wished to possess not just gold, but every version of Homer, every medical treatise, every history, every play, every astronomical table that could be persuaded into papyrus and ink. The lost library begins, then, not with fire, but with a rival, a mast against evening, a rope thrown down to the quay, a customs official opening a chest, a scroll case, worn at the edges, lifted out of a traveler's bundle and carried toward the city. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. At night, a harbor pilot coming in toward Alexandria would have watched the flame of the Pharaohs and steered by it, slowly, carefully, feeling the harbor water change under the hull. Long before a scroll reached a shelf, it first came toward that small light on the sea, the city saying, in fire, this way. Alexandria did not grow the way older cities often grow, by accident, with lanes bending around wells, shrines, walls, old trees, and arguments no one remembers. It was planned. Ancient writers describe a city laid out with broad, straight streets crossing one another in a clean pattern. We should not imagine modern city planning exactly, with every block measured by surveyors in reflective vests, but the point is clear enough. Alexandria was meant to feel deliberate. It was a ruler's city, a port city, and a display case, drawn with confidence on the edge of an older land. There is something slightly strange about a planned city in Egypt. So much of Egyptian civilization had grown along the Nile's soft curves, with villages and fields answering the river. Alexandria answered the sea and the ruler's hand. It looked north across the water toward the Greek-speaking world, while behind it the Nile still moved through a country of older gods. In that tension, the city found its particular life. People came there in layers. Macedonian and Greek settlers came with the new dynasty. Egyptians lived and worked in and around the city, though the ruling court often kept its own language and customs. Jewish communities became important there too, large enough that Greek-speaking Jewish life in Alexandria would leave a deep mark on religious history. Merchants arrived because ships arrived. Sailors came because sailors always go where there is a harbor. Translators, doctors, mathematicians, poets, priests, servants, dock workers, tax collectors, and cooks all became part of the city's daily noise. This matters for the library because knowledge does not float by itself. It needs streets, it needs rooms, it needs food brought to tables, lamps refilled, clerks paid, papyrus bought, arguments tolerated, and roofs repaired when damp begins to creep in. A library is not only a set of shelves, it is a city deciding, day after day, that keeping those shelves is worth the trouble. The royal quarter was the heart of that decision. Somewhere within the palace district, near gardens and courts and lecture rooms, the Mouseion and its library took shape. We cannot walk its rooms with certainty. No archaeologist can point to a standing wall and say, here, exactly here, a scholar first unrolled this copy of Sophocles. Alexandria has been lived on, rebuilt, shaken, drowned, and rearranged for more than 2,000 years. Some of the old city lies under the modern one, some under water, some under stories. But we can picture the arrangement in human terms. A scholar might move from his lodging through a shaded walkway, past a garden, into a room where scrolls were stored in boxes or shelves. He might carry a wax tablet for notes, because papyrus was too valuable for idle scratching. He might hear Greek in one doorway, Egyptian in the market, another language on the quay, and the creak of carts carrying grain towards storage. The city's plan gave all this a frame. Straight streets do not make a city wise, but they make movement easier. They let carts, officials, messengers, and processions find their way. They turn royal intention into stone and dust. A library in such a city is part of the same gesture, an attempt to lay order across something too large to hold by instinct alone. There were temples, too, because no ancient city lived by reason alone. Alexandria held Greek forms and Egyptian forms beside one another, sometimes uneasily, sometimes creatively. The god Serapis, promoted by the Ptolemies, blended Greek and Egyptian religious imagination into a figure meant, in part, to belong to both worlds. That sort of blending is rarely as smooth on the ground as it looks in royal policy, but it tells us what Alexandria wanted to be. A city where older traditions and new power could stand in the same square without immediately knocking each other over. The library belonged to that ambition. It was cosmopolitan before the word became soft from overuse. It was a machine for collecting difference and making it legible to the court. Poems from one place, medical writings from another, histories from another, astronomical observations from somewhere else, all brought into rooms where they could be labeled, compared, copied, and argued over. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. In a newly planned city, dust settles first into the grooves between stones, finding the straight lines before anyone has had time to make them old. Imagine an Alexandrian street at evening, long and pale, the sea at one end, the royal quarter at the other, and a thin line of dust gathering quietly where the stones meet. The word Mouseion gives us our word museum, but it did not mean quite what museum means now. It was the house or shrine of the Muses, those Greek figures who watched over poetry, history, music, astronomy, and the other arts of remembering and making. In Alexandria, the Mouseion was not only a sacred idea, it was an institution. It gathered scholars under royal patronage, gave them a place to work, and, at least in the ideal picture, freed them from some of the ordinary bargaining that consumes a life. Imagine, if you like, a place where a mathematician, a poet, a geographer, a doctor, and a grammarian could all be fed at the same table by the king's money, each of them convinced that his own problem was the one that deserved the mourning. This is not a modern university, though it has a family resemblance to one. It was smaller, more royal, more dependent on court favor, and probably more intimate in its rivalries. But the basic idea still feels recognizable. Bring clever people together, give them books, give them time, see what happens. What happened over generations was extraordinary enough that even the lost pieces still cast a shadow. The library was the visible symbol, the thing everyone remembers, but the Mouseion was the living body around it. Scrolls do not read themselves. They need eyes, voices, hands, and pride. They need someone to notice that one copy of a poem has a word that another copy lacks. They need someone to ask whether an old medical claim is true or merely old. They need someone to measure, recalculate, object, preserve, and sometimes be irritatingly correct. The scholars of Alexandria lived in a world before printed pages, before page numbers, before footnotes as we know them, before a book could be reproduced by the thousand without the original being touched. A text was a physical thing, and every copy carried a history of hands. A tired scribe might skip a line. A local tradition might preserve a different reading. A famous poem could exist in several forms, each with its defenders. To compare texts was not a game. It was a way of deciding what, exactly, the past had said. Royal support made this possible, but royal support also made it fragile. A ruler who loves scholars can feed them. A ruler who loses interest can let the roof leak. A library tied to a court is never just tied to knowledge. It is tied to succession, money, palace politics, and the moods of powerful people who may not care whether a rare commentary survives the year. Still, for a time, Alexandria had the confidence of abundance. Scholars could work in gardens and covered walks. They could dine together. They could consult scrolls from different parts of the world. They could write works so large that later readers would preserve only fragments and titles, as if the original books had sunk beneath the surface and left a few floating planks. It is worth slowing down here, because the old idea of the scholar in the library can become too clean. A scholar's day is not made only of revelation. It is made of small delays, finding the right scroll, discovering that it is the wrong copy, waiting for a clerk, sharpening a reed, changing seats because the light has moved, realizing that the note you need is on a wax tablet in another room. Knowledge advances through such unglamorous errands. The mind may leap, but the body still has to fetch things. The Mouseion gave those errands a home. It made scholarship a daily practice rather than a heroic accident. That may be its deepest importance. A single brilliant person can discover something. An institution can make room for brilliance to happen more than once. And so the Library of Alexandria should not be imagined as a tomb of books, silent and waiting for disaster. It was noisy in the way work is noisy, low voices, footsteps, someone coughing over dust, a reed pen touching papyrus, a disagreement starting again after dinner because neither man had managed to sleep it off. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. In the Mouseion, scholars may have eaten at a common table, supported by the king like a strange household of professional rememberers. Picture a dinner couch after the meal is done, a cup set aside, and beside it, a stack of notes still drying in the lamplight, waiting for morning. If Alexandria wanted to gather the world's books, it first had to solve a very ordinary problem. Books were objects, and objects have to be found. In the ancient Mediterranean, a book was usually a scroll. Papyrus sheets were made from the pith of a reed that grew in Egypt's marshes, cut into strips, laid crosswise, pressed, dried, smoothed, and joined. The result was light, useful, and vulnerable. A scroll could be carried in a case, stored in a box, tied with a label, and unrolled across the knees. It could also tear, stain, mold, fade, burn, be eaten at the edge, or simply become too worn to trust. So collecting books meant collecting fragile things. It meant sending agents to find texts. It meant buying, borrowing, requesting, copying, and sometimes, if later stories are to be believed, behaving with royal boldness. One famous story says that ships arriving in Alexandria were searched for books. Any scrolls found on board were taken to be copied. The owner received the copy, while the original stayed in the royal library. It is a perfect Alexandrian story, grand, aggressive, flattering to the library's appetite, and just a little too tidy. We should hold it carefully. It may preserve a real policy or a later exaggeration of one, or the kind of tale people tell about a place that had become legendary for wanting every text it could get. But even as a story, it tells us what people believed about the library. Alexandria was hungry. The hunger was not only for beautiful literature. Poems mattered, especially Homer, whose lines carried an authority across the Greek-speaking world. Tragedies mattered, histories mattered, but so did medicine, mathematics, astronomy, geography, grammar, philosophy, religious texts, technical works, and lists. Ancient learning loved lists more than we usually give it credit for. Lists of rulers, victors, words, plants, stars, books, authors, cities, ships. A list is a shelf made of language. Once a scroll arrived, someone had to copy it. Copying was not clerical in the small sense. It was preservation. Every copy made a text more likely to survive the accident that would destroy another. It also created new chances for error. A library that copies everything is saving memory and quietly changing it at the same time, one tired eye at a time. Think of the room where this work happened. Not a dramatic chamber, perhaps. A table, a stool, a reed pen, a small vessel of black ink. A sheet held flat against its own wish to curl back into the shape of a plant. The scribe's hand moves across the papyrus in practiced strokes, and the text passes from one body to another, from the old scroll, through the eye, into the hand, and onto the new sheet. There is a gentleness in that, and also a tension. A scribe must be faithful without becoming mechanical. He must see every word, not merely recognize the shape of the line and let his mind sleep. He must keep his place when two lines begin the same way. He must not improve what he does not understand, though human beings have always found that difficult. A copied text is an act of trust between strangers separated by time. Alexandria's rulers may have sought originals, but history is less interested in originals than collectors are. An original can vanish in a damp room. A copy can carry its words elsewhere. The survival of ancient literature often depended not on one perfect scroll locked safely in a royal collection, but on many imperfect copies moving through hands, schools, libraries, monasteries, and private rooms over many centuries. This is why the story of Alexandria is both grand and humbling. The great library wanted the best copies, the oldest copies, the authoritative copies. But what saved anything in the long run was multiplication. One text, copied again and again, became a small population. Some members died. A few descendants survived. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Papyrus wants to curl. A scribe copying a scroll might hold an edge down with a smooth stone or a small weight while the ink dried. Imagine that little stone on the corner of the sheet, doing no thinking at all, and yet helping a line cross safely from one century toward another. A library that grows large enough develops a second problem. It is no longer enough to own a book. You have to find it. This is where Alexandria becomes wonderfully human. The dream was universal, almost impossible, collect the writings of the known world. But the daily answer was practical, make a catalogue. The name most closely tied to that answer is Callimachus, a poet and scholar associated with Alexandria, often credited with creating or shaping the Pinax, the great catalogue of the library. The word means something like tablets or lists. It was not a small card drawer. Ancient sources suggest it ran to many books in its own right, a catalogue so large it became a work of scholarship by itself. We do not possess the Pinax. That is one of the small ironies that follows the Library of Alexandria everywhere. Even the catalogue of the lost books is itself lost, but later references let us see the shape of the effort. Works were grouped by kinds: epic poets, tragic poets, comic poets, historians, philosophers, physicians, lawgivers, and more. Authors were identified, titles were recorded. Sometimes the opening words of a work helped distinguish one text from another, because titles in the ancient world were not always stable in the way we expect. There is something deeply tender about recording the first words of a book so that it will not be confused with another. It is like remembering someone's face by the way they enter a room. Cataloguing sounds dry until you imagine the alternative. A large, uncatalogued library is not a treasury. It is a storm indoors. Scrolls can be misplaced, duplicated, misattributed, confused, or quietly forgotten while still sitting on a shelf. A catalogue turns possession into access. It tells the future where the door is. Callimachus himself, if we trust the tradition, was not merely a clerk. He was a poet of sharp intelligence and taste, the sort of person who might care deeply about the difference between a long poem and a good one. That matters because a catalogue is never neutral in the simple way it pretends to be. Categories reveal how a culture understands knowledge. What belongs beside what? Is medicine closer to philosophy or craft? Is a poem known by its author, its first line, its subject, or the shelf it happened to occupy? Even a list has a worldview hiding inside it. At Alexandria, the catalogue was a tool of control and devotion at once. It let scholars know what the library held. It let the institution see itself. It made the collection less like a pile of captured things and more like an ordered memory. But a catalogue also creates a particular kind of ache for us, because a title can survive after the book is gone. Ancient literature is full of such shadows: works we know by name, authors we know by reputation, treatises quoted once by someone else, plays that were famous enough to be listed and not lucky enough to be copied into our hands. A lost title is like a label on an empty drawer. It proves something was there. It does not give it back. The pinaches must have been full of such labels before they became ghosts. At the time, of course, they were not ghosts. They were working tools. A scholar wanting a particular author might consult the catalogue, find a title, request a scroll, and wait while someone went to fetch it. The process may have been slow by our standards, but slowness is not the same as disorder. A good catalogue makes waiting worthwhile. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Scrolls often had small tags, sometimes called silly boy, tied to them so a reader could identify the work without unrolling the whole thing. Picture a tiny tag hanging from a rolled papyrus in the dim shelf light, a name on a thread, saving someone from having to open the darkness to know what it held. One of the gentlest ways to understand Alexandria is to leave the library for a moment and stand in the sun. The scholar to follow is Eratosthenes, who became head of the library in the 3rd century before our era. He was the sort of person later ages have trouble naming neatly. He worked with geography, mathematics, poetry, chronology, and criticism. A person like that can look scattered from a distance, but in Alexandria such range made a certain sense. The shelves were close together. So were the questions. Eratosthenes is most famous for estimating the size of the earth, and the story in its simple form is almost too elegant. He heard that at Syene, far south along the Nile, the sun at noon on the summer solstice shone straight down into a well, leaving little or no shadow. In Alexandria, at the same time, a vertical stick did cast a shadow. If the sun's rays were effectively parallel and the two cities stood on the same curved earth, then the difference in shadow angle could reveal the curve between them. Measure the angle, estimate the distance, multiply. The exact details are still discussed, and ancient measurements are not always easy to translate into ours. But the achievement remains beautiful. With a well, a shadow, a distance along the Nile, and a mind trained to trust geometry, Eratosthenes came remarkably close to the Earth's circumference. There is no need to make him more miraculous than he was. That would do him no favors. The point is not that one man guessed perfectly. The point is that the Library of Alexandria belonged to a world where such a measurement could be imagined, debated, recorded, and passed on. A shadow in one city and a shadowless noon in another became not a curiosity, but a way of touching the planet's shape. That is what an institution can do for attention. It gives attention somewhere to land. A traveler reports a fact. A scholar recognizes its use. A library has texts on geometry, maps, earlier measurements, accounts of distance, and the leisure, paid for by power, to turn an odd report into an argument about the Earth. We should picture the tools simply: a vertical rod, a marked angle, a distance measured imperfectly by people who walked or surveyed or counted stages along a route, a wax tablet for calculation, a papyrus draft, perhaps a colleague who thought the numbers were wrong and said so too loudly after dinner. The result was not a flash of modern science appearing early by magic. It was ancient scholarship doing what ancient scholarship could do at its best, joining observation to inherited methods with patience. Eratosthenes also worked on maps. He tried to arrange the known world with lines of latitude and longitude, not in the precise modern sense, but as a step toward placing cities and regions in relation to one another. Maps are another kind of catalogue. They put distance into order. They let the mind hold what the feet cannot walk in a day. The library helped make that possible because it gathered reports from elsewhere. A port city hears things, sailors know coasts, soldiers know roads, tax officials know distances, merchants know where goods spoil, priests know calendars, farmers know seasons, scholars know how to turn such scraps into systems if someone gives them enough scraps and enough quiet. This chapter is not only about one famous measurement, it is about the library as a place where the ordinary world could be made legible. Sunlight falls, a stick casts a shadow, the Nile runs between cities. Out of these plain things, a mind can begin to draw the earth. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. At Mouseion, the story says, sunlight at noon could fall straight down into a deep well. Imagine that small round darkness in the ground, and for one high moment of the year, the sun touching the water at the bottom without leaning on the wall. A whole planet, hinted at by a quiet circle of light. A great library is not peaceful because everyone agrees. It is peaceful because disagreement has been given a table, a lamp, and time. Alexandria's scholars argued with texts and with one another. They compared versions of Homer, whose poems had traveled for centuries through singers, cities, schools, and copyists. They studied rare words. They marked doubtful lines. They wrote commentaries, corrections, glosses, and treatises about works that seemed to deserve not only reading, but guarding. This may sound fussy from a distance. It is not. If a culture treasures a poem, eventually someone will ask which words belong to it. When several copies disagree, the question becomes practical. Do you keep the longer line or the shorter one, the familiar reading or the difficult one, the version that makes better sense or the version that looks older precisely because it is less smooth? Every choice is a small judgment about how memory behaves. The work was not limited to literature. Alexandria became associated with advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, geography, mechanics, and grammar. Euclid, whose elements organized geometry so powerfully that students would live under its roof for centuries, is connected with Alexandria, though the details of his life are dim. Herophilus and Erasistratus are associated with medical study in the city, including anatomical work that later readers found both important and troubling. We do not need to dwell there. It is enough to say that Alexandria was a place where the body, the heavens, language, and number all came under careful examination. Translation belonged there too. A famous tradition connects Alexandria with the Greek translation of Jewish scripture known as the Septuagint. The legend tells of translators working with remarkable agreement, a story shaped by reverence as much as history. But behind the legend stands a real need, a large Jewish community in a Greek-speaking city wanting sacred texts in the language many of them used. Translation is not only the movement of words, it is the movement of a community's memory into a new room. All of this made Alexandria intellectually alive, and life includes irritation. Scholars had reputations, they had rivals, they made jokes, they dismissed one another. A man who spends his life deciding whether a line is genuine may become a difficult dinner companion. That is all right. The history of knowledge has always depended partly on difficult dinner companions. Still, the arguments had a craft to them. A textual critic did not simply say, "I prefer this version." He looked for evidence. Which copy was older? Which reading explained the others? Which line sounded like the poet and which sounded like a helpful later hand? Ancient methods were not ours in every detail, but the impulse is familiar. Do not only inherit the text, examine it. In a room full of scrolls, this work has a physical rhythm. Unroll one copy, set a weight, unroll another, align the passage, mark a variant, dictate a note, roll one scroll back up before the edge phrase, ask for another. The mind may be comparing poetry, but the hands are always managing papyrus. The library's greatness lived in that combination, high thought and delicate handling. No glowing screens, no search box, no instant list of every occurrence of a word. Just trained memory, catalogs, assistants, tags, shelves, and the patience to read again. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Somewhere in Alexandria, two copies of the same old line may have lain open side by side, one word different between them. A scholar bent over that difference by lamplight, not because it would make him rich, but because he believed the past deserved to be heard as clearly as possible. Now we come to the fire, because everyone comes to the fire eventually. The popular version is simple. The Library of Alexandria burned, and with it, the wisdom of the ancient world vanished in one night. It is a powerful story. It has everything a memory likes: a great treasure, a single catastrophe, a clear villain if one is needed, and the ache of imagining what might have been saved if only someone had carried one more scroll out of the smoke. But history, when handled gently, asks us to loosen our grip on the simple version. There was a fire in the time of Julius Caesar. During the Alexandrian War, around the middle of the 1st century before our era, Caesar was caught in the cities fighting, and ancient sources report that ships in the harbor were burned. Fire near ships can become fire near warehouses very quickly. Later writers connect this event with the loss of books, perhaps many books, perhaps books stored near the docks, perhaps copies waiting for transport or storage. The details are difficult. The closer sources are not as neat as the later memory. So we can say this much without shouting. Caesar's war likely caused serious damage around the harbor, and some collection of books may have been lost. We cannot honestly say that one blaze destroyed the whole Library of Alexandria in the form people imagine. By then, the institution's history was already complicated. Collections may have existed in more than one place. The library may have changed in size, status, and organization over time. Some losses were sudden, others were slow. This does not make the fire unimportant. It only makes it human-sized again. Picture the harbor at night, not as the end of all knowledge, but as a real disaster in a real place. Ships burn hot, rope catches, pitch and timber make a terrible fuel, smoke moves low over water, men shout orders that cannot be heard, a warehouse door blackens, a stack of papyrus, if fire reaches it, does not argue, it gives itself up at once. There is grief enough in that, without making it carry every loss that came after. The reason the single fire story survives is that it gives us somewhere to put our sorrow. It is hard to mourn neglect, budget cuts, damp, political change, lost copying chains, shifting languages, and centuries of ordinary decay. Those are not cinematic. A fire is. A fire has an edge, before and after, flame and ash, but libraries usually die in more than one way. They die when rulers stop paying. They die when scholars leave. They die when a room is damaged and not repaired. They die when a book is not copied because no one this year thinks it matters. They die when the language of a text becomes less familiar, when schools change their curriculum, when a work is quoted enough that no one copies the whole thing, when insects find a shelf before a librarian does. The fire everyone remembers may have been one wound among many. That is less dramatic, but it is closer to how fragile things usually disappear. And perhaps it gives us a better warning. If all knowledge is lost only in great flames, then we need only watch for flames. But if knowledge is also lost by interruption, indifference, damp, and delay, then preservation becomes a quieter duty. A duty of copying, cataloging, funding, teaching, and noticing when the roof has begun to leak. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. After a harbor fire, a rope ring on a post can remain blackened long after the shouting ends. Imagine one dark circle on the wood beside the water, not the whole story of the library, just one mark from one night, smoke held in the grain. The saddest verb in the history of libraries may not be burn, it may be stop. Stop copying, stop paying, stop teaching, stop asking for that text, stop repairing that shelf, stop reading that language with ease, stop believing that this old work is worth the labor of another clean copy. The Library of Alexandria, if we are honest, disappears from history the way many institutions do, not in one clean sentence, but through gaps. We hear of it and then hear less. We hear of related collections, of the serapeum, of scholars, of conflict, of changing rulers, of changing priorities. The clear outline blurs. At some point, the great library as an institution is gone, but no ancient clerk has left us a tidy final receipt saying, "Closed today, no further loans." This is unsatisfying, which is one reason people prefer the fire, but unsatisfying is often where truth lives. Alexandria changed hands, changed languages, changed religions, changed economies, and changed its place in the world. The Ptolemies gave way to Roman rule. The city remained important, but the royal conditions that had created the Mouseion were not eternal. Later centuries brought political violence, religious conflict, and shifts in patronage. The Serapeum, a major temple complex associated with its own collections, was destroyed in the late 4th century during Christian conflict with older pagan institutions. That event matters. It marks the end of a world in Alexandria, but even it should not be made to carry the entire legend of the library on its back. The long losing was broader than any one event. Papyrus itself required care. In Egypt's dry places, texts could survive astonishingly well if buried or stored by luck. In a busy coastal city with damp air, handling, insects, and use, a scroll was not immortal. To preserve a work, someone had to copy it before it failed. Then someone had to copy that copy. Preservation was a chain of attention, and every chain has weak links. Some works survived because schools kept using them. Students copied Homer. Philosophers copied Plato and Aristotle, though even there the story is complicated. Mathematicians preserved Euclid because geometry remained useful and teachable. Medical writers survived when later physicians found them worth reading. Other works, no less loved once, fell out of use. A play not chosen for school can vanish. A history that exists in one copy can become a title. A poem admired by a few can become a quotation inside someone else's grammar lesson. This is not always because later people were foolish. Every age has limited hands. Copying is work. Papyrus, parchment, ink, time, and trained attention cost something. To copy one book can mean not copying another. Survival is shaped by love, habit, usefulness, accident, fashion, climate, conquest, and the quiet arithmetic of labor. The Library of Alexandria has become the symbol of all this because it promised the opposite. It promised that if enough scrolls could be gathered, if enough scholars could be fed, if enough catalog entries could be written, then memory might be held against time. For a while, perhaps it was, but time is patient too. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. A scroll label can fade before the scroll itself is gone. The little tag tied to the outside, touched by fingers, exposed to dust and light, may lose its ink first. Then the work is still there, but harder to find, already beginning its disappearance by becoming nameless. Alexandria was never the only place where books mattered. It is easy, because the legend is so large, to let the Library of Alexandria swallow the entire ancient world of learning in our imagination. But other shelves stood under other roofs. Other scholars copied, argued, taught, borrowed, and preserved. The ancient Mediterranean was not one lamp in one room. It was many small lamps, some bright, some nearly out, some carried from house to house when the weather changed. Pergamum in Asia Minor became famous for its own library and scholarly life. Later stories like to set it in rivalry with Alexandria, as if the two collections were kings across a board. There is probably some truth in the rivalry, because courts compete in prestige as naturally as merchants compete in price. A ruler who gathers books is not only serving knowledge. He is announcing that learned people should look toward his city too. One tradition says that Egypt restricted the export of papyrus to hamper pergamum, and that parchment, prepared animal skin, grew in importance there as a result. The story is tidy, and like many tidy stories, should be treated gently. Parchment existed before any such rivalry, and the history of writing materials is larger than one royal argument. Still, the association between pergamum and parchment remained strong enough to leave a mark in language. A book can carry a place name quietly, long after the place has become a ruin. What matters for our purposes is that books moved, scholars moved, methods moved. A commentary written in one city could be copied in another. A student's notes could travel farther than the student ever did. A text ignored by one community could be valued by another. Preservation often depended on this dispersal. A book kept in only one grand library was honored, but vulnerable. A book copied into many smaller rooms had more chances to wake up in the future. That is one of the strange comforts in the story of Alexandria. The library's ambition was centralizing. It wanted everything brought to one place, labeled, compared, and made available under royal care. But survival often works by scattering. Seeds do not survive because they remain in one bowl. They survive because some fall elsewhere. Ancient texts traveled through schools, private collections, temple archives, civic libraries, and later monastic and scholarly networks. They crossed into translation. Greek works moved into Syriac and Arabic. Some returned to Latin Europe through paths no Alexandrian librarian could have imagined. A theorem, a medical claim, a philosophical argument, or a story about the stars could pass through hands that did not share a language, a religion, or a calendar, and still carry something forward. This is not a clean rescue story. At every crossing, something could change. A translator chooses one word and not another. A teacher abridges, a copyist misreads. A scholar preserves a fragment only because it helps him make a different point. Yet imperfect survival is still survival. A cracked cup can still hold water if you are careful with it. So when we mourn Alexandria, we should not imagine all memory sealed behind one door. The loss was immense, but the world was not empty afterward. Other shelves kept working. Other readers kept making choices. Some of what Alexandria gathered had already traveled onward, or would be known through people who had studied there, or through books copied from books copied from books. The library's disappearance, then, is not the end of ancient knowledge. It is one of the great interruptions in a much longer relay. The runner falls. Others, already on the road, keep going with whatever they carry. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. A copied book sometimes preserves more than its text. It preserves the marks of travel, a note in one hand, a correction in another, a stain from a table in a city far from where it began. Imagine a scroll or codex arriving on a new shelf, not pristine, but alive with the evidence that it has already survived several rooms. At the end of a story about a lost library, it is tempting to count what vanished. We can do some of that. Ancient authors mention works we no longer have. Titles survive without texts. Fragments survive without books. Whole fields of writing are thinner than they once were. Of the many Greek tragedies performed and admired, only a small shelf reaches us complete. Histories disappeared, poems disappeared, scientific works disappeared. Arguments disappeared so thoroughly that we know them only from the replies of people who disagreed. But if we only count absence, we miss the quieter miracle. Some things did survive. They survived because they were copied in Alexandria, or copied elsewhere, or quoted, summarized, taught, translated, argued with, excerpted, loved, misunderstood, and needed. A line could pass into a commentary. A theorem could pass into a school text. A medical opinion could be preserved because a later physician wanted to refute it. A poem could survive because someone found it beautiful enough to copy when the old sheet grew weak. The shelves of Alexandria are gone, but the habit they represented did not end there. Other libraries rose, Pergamum became famous, Rome collected, private readers kept books. Later monasteries copied texts by hand in rooms far from the Mediterranean harbor where the pharaohs once burned. Scholars in Arabic, Syriac, Greek, Latin, and other languages carried ancient learning into new worlds of thought. Knowledge did not pass forward in a straight, clean line. It crossed borders, changed scripts, entered new arguments, and sometimes came back wearing a different coat. That is why the Library of Alexandria is both a wound and a warning, but not only a wound and not only a warning. It is also an image of desire. The desire to gather, to compare, to preserve, to say that no poem is too old, no measurement too small, no variant too fussy, no label too humble, if it helps the future hear the past a little more clearly. We should be honest about the loss. There are books we will never read. There are plays whose jokes no one will explain to us. There are histories whose witnesses are gone. There are maps that would change how we imagine ancient travel. There are scientific works that might show us a mind taking a path we did not know was open. The empty shelves are real. But the surviving fragments are real too. A quotation embedded in another author, a title in a list, a papyrus scrap found in dry sand, a theorem copied into a later classroom, a story retold so often that it changed shape and still carried a small hard seed of memory inside it. These are not the library entire, they are what drifted ashore. Imagine, if you like, one of those surviving lines at night. It sits in a later book, copied by someone who may not have known the older work was almost gone. Around it, the new author's sentence continues. Before it, an argument. After it, an explanation. But in the middle, a few words from a lost shelf still breathe, like lamplight seen under a door. That may be the gentlest way to leave Alexandria. Not with flames, and not with the fantasy that everything can be restored, but with a small respect for the copy, the catalogue, the patient reader, and the hand that writes something down, because it ought not vanish yet. The Pharaohs no longer guides ships into the old harbor. The Mouseion is gone. The catalogue that tried to hold the world is itself a lost book. But the impulse remains whenever someone labels a folder, backs up a file, writes a note in the margin, teaches an old poem to a new student, or saves a fragile thing because the future may want it. That is where the archive and the library meet, not in grandeur, really, in care. That's where I'll close the file for tonight. The archive will be here tomorrow. It always is. Sleep well.